Victim blame it. Even though he tried to keep it quiet, the whole friend group had wind of what happened. When we finally got together, the teasing and prodding became too much, and he spilled the beans. We all listened intently as our older friend told us the mundane tale in his own words. The phone rang. He began his story. At that moment, I picked up the phone in my hand and saw that the caller was an unknown number. The voice on the other end first asked for confirmation whether or not I was the person he was talking to. Am I speaking to Mr. Hu? I am listening, I confirmed. The man introduced himself. I am F.A., the public prosecutor from A. We are currently in the middle of an operation that we have been preparing for 3 months. We have determined that an officer working at the S-Bank in your district is a member of a fraud network. We have included you in this operation as a state official. However, in order to prevent our conversations from leaking out for the security of the operation, we are keeping our conversation secret from now on. You will not turn off your phone. Frankly, I was bored. I hadn't been able to fix the plumbing problem that I had been trying to fix since the morning. Moreover, I didn't want to waste one of the last days of my life on a crime that didn't concern me. However, based entirely on the principle of good faith, I couldn't help but doubt the truth of what was being said. However, the frequent warning messages from the police and the bank about phone fraud were still in the phone's memory. I told them I wanted to meet them face to face. The person on the phone who said he was a prosecutor responded that I was completely right to think so in terms of trust, but that it would have operational problems. He then gave brief and striking examples of my family ties, my past, and my areas of interest, and asked me to call 155 from the keypad without hanging up, and to verify the information about him. I knew that the phone number he gave me had been discontinued, but I did as I was asked. The voice that came to me immediately gave me the name of the prosecutor on duty, as if it knew what I was going to ask. A sense of trust was being created. In addition, the prosecutor included national and religious values in his speech. At one point, instead of the formal, distant address due to my age, he made a meaningless request such as, "Can I call you brother?" Our old friend smiled faintly, but the incomprehensible expression in his eyes was immediately replaced by bitterness. No matter how much I resisted, there was an effective argument in the psychological world I was drawn into. This argument was the use of detailed information in the conversations. It was as if information about the siblings and the deceased mother and father were sprinkled into the prosecutor's speech based on some data placed in an Excel program. Moreover, the information about the surviving siblings, which was in the records of various ministries such as the Interior, Health, Trade, and which should have been confidential, as well as the information on social media, was as if it had been transferred to a file and was at his disposal, and he was using it skillfully. Finally, the prosecutor concluded his remarks and handed the conversation over to the chief of police, to whom he was in charge, for me to take the necessary instructions. Strangely enough, the tone and manner of voice of the prosecutor and then the police chief fit the prototypes you can visualize in your head. Just as when you talk to an artificial intelligence, the same mind process that leads you to the perception that you are talking to a human being was working in the same way while listening to the prosecutor and the police chief on the phone. The voice you heard on the phone was the same as that of a real prosecutor or police chief. Instead of being skeptical, you inevitably accept the authenticity of the short, precise, and commanding style. And it reminded me at that moment of a conversation I had with a police officer many years ago. When he learnt of my training, the officer had asked the following question directly. Is there any way of knowing whether a person is guilty or not? The answer to this question was given many years later by the suspects in a child murder case that occupied the national agenda for quite some time. Everyone around the table remembered that heinous incident, reminiscent of the film The Secret of the Town from years ago, which insisted on remaining unsolved. Our old friend took a short break. He took a last sip from the teacup in front of him. He looked thoughtful. We were all eagerly waiting to see how the story would continue. The police chief, he continued. Finally, he got to the point. He wanted me to transfer the money in my bank account to the given IBAN number via the internet branch. Whether this was their first operation, I cannot say. But the bargaining started, and I offered the police chief to deposit 1/5 of the account instead of the whole amount. The voice on the other side of the phone said that at that amount, the man would not even come to the bank to withdraw it. But at my insistence, he exploded and began to speak angrily and threateningly. Suddenly, he turned into a bad cop. At one point, he talked about sending officers to pick me up. But when there was no response from me, he asked me with curiosity and suspicion if I was there. I could hear a voice, but it was the voice of a moaning person. My medicines, he said in a low voice, breathing with difficulty. Everyone was absorbed in the flow of the story, not thinking whether the crisis our old friend had suffered was real or not. He, on the other hand, continued his speech with an indescribable pleasure from our intense interest. I don't know whether the person on the other end of the phone was alarmed or not, but he immediately started giving me advice. On the one hand, he was telling me to drink water. On the other, he was trying to make excuses for the threat. He told me that they hadn't slept for 3 months because of this operation, and he wanted me to agree with them. What I feared was happening to me, muttered our old friend, with a countenance that I could not decide whether thoughtful or sad. What was it? I asked, but he ignored my question. After long efforts, due to the precautions taken by the bank, the online transfer could not take place. This time, the chief of police asked me to make the transaction at the bank before the end of working hours. However, I had to hurry. I told him that the branch was 20 minutes away, but added that I could make it by bicycle. The phone would be switched on in any case, and I set off immediately. The excitement in the audience was at its final stage. Breaths were held. Halfway through, I switched off the phone, which I was asked to keep switched on at all times. A message from my nephew, who had been trying to reach me for some time, caught my eye. "Uncle, you are being swindled right now." Surprised, I thought, how could he be aware of this? But I immediately remembered that the fraudsters had given detailed information about my brothers to build trust. Like a police operation, a fraudster operation. I wonder how long it took them to prepare for this. At the same time, the phone rang. It was a different number from the city center. A police officer from the provincial police, a friend of my nephew, confirmed the information in the message. He advised me to freeze my bank account immediately. I told him that I would go to the police headquarters. It was late in the working hours, and the phone, which I did not answer because the operation was not yet over, kept ringing. It was easy to enter the building of the police headquarters, where there was an armed guard at the door, but I was having trouble finding the person I was going to apply to. After wandering around the corridors for a while without seeing anyone around, I knocked on the door and entered a room where an officer taking a statement asked me what I wanted. "I am being defrauded right now," I said in a low voice. Although the officer told me where to go, I continued to wander back and forth in the building where I could not see anyone in the corridors. Obviously, the police had secured itself against the dangers of the outside world. At that moment, I remember listening to a radio theater that described the psychological state I was in. It was a play about a person who gets lost in the corridors of a building and cannot find his way. Finally, I reached the fraud office with the guidance of an officer I met completely by coincidence, and by opening the closed and encrypted corridor doors. The officer in charge here told me that the first thing to do was to freeze the account in the bank, and when I could not do this over the phone, he sent me to the bank with a police officer in official clothes. After the necessary procedures were carried out to freeze the account, we returned to the police station to make a statement. When I explained what had happened and said that the time spent with the fraudsters was about 3 hours, the officer was surprised. He said that usually this interview was completed within an hour. Afterwards, I remembered that I had left out some details when I gave my statement to him. This was not important to the police. I think they were more interested in the material clues than in my thoughts, as they were the experts. In my mind, a vague proof of the authenticity of the operation against me was that the operations chief on the phone told me that he would send a team of gendarmes or police officers to the house to make it convincing, but that I was not to contact them in any way. This had happened. The first thing that came to my mind was that there might be someone or some people in the police or gendarmerie who knowingly or unknowingly helped the fraudsters. The phone numbers of the fraudsters who called me and the IBAN numbers they asked me to deposit the money were not enough to catch the perpetrators. Before asking me whether I would lodge a complaint, the officer who took my statement convincingly explained that although the organization has a cybersecurity department, investigating such cases is often fruitless. During our short conversation, the police officer mentioned the high rate of youth crime. When I asked him whether he was hopeful about young people, his face briefly showed a vague expression of emotion, but he did not express his personal opinion. His response was within the boundaries of what was expected of him as an organization. Everyone around the table took a deep breath. But the story was not over. When our old friend telephoned his siblings after the incident, he learned that all of them had been hit at the same time. His sister, who was 800 kilometers away, was the first to realize that this was a fraud attempt. She immediately understood that the callers were fraudsters and hung up the phone to avoid answering. They took his older brother, who was also 750 kilometers away, out of the house and directed him to the district police station. And when he entered the police station and made a report, the contact was broken. The younger brother's son immediately realized that the phone call was about fraud and called his uncle, who was 1,000 kilometers away, several times to warn him. Our old friend paused for a moment and felt the need to provide additional information. Actually, such activities are not limited to this. What is more thought-provoking is the use of artificial intelligence in fraudulent activities. You know, the algorithms in a number of programs which are available for pennies on the dollar and are therefore illegal present a personalized file based on the unique interests and interaction history of each internet user. This means that these programs not only detect what we have done in the past, but also predict what we will do in the future. When asked what should be done against these fraudsters, artificial intelligence, like the police and banks, emphasizes, quote, the attention of the interlocutor. That is, the target person, the victim. Don't say, they can't fool me. They make you listen to a speech of a voice you recognize, or watch a video of a relative of yours with the help of artificial intelligence, and all your thoughts change in the desired direction. Our old friend was rich in knowledge and had a lot to say on this subject. Of course, we could not have known that his interest in the subject dated back to the past. The experience of the thief I caught on a bus when I was a young man was one of mixed emotions. It was upsetting for me that he was subjected to humiliating behavior by the guards. The offender should have been dealt with by the law, not by unwritten rules. At one point, an official who saw me thinking said the following: "It is their profession. They do not change. Only as long as they are away from society, people are safe." This subject of fraud has indirectly interested me for a long time, said our old friend. It formed a subsection of my thesis on human behavior under difficult conditions. While I was telling you what I had been through, I touched upon a point that I had touched upon once in a while, and that is that the trick is to manage your perceptions. For a while, this became a much talked about topic in politics: perception management. That is, the common point between a politician and a fraudster is to make you see the issue from a certain angle, to draw your attention to a point, to make you concentrate there, to draw your mind into a circle. In layman's terms, look the other way. In the years after World War II, the months-long, extensive indoctrination techniques applied by the Chinese in the Far East to prisoners of war, as well as to missionaries, scientists, and doctors living in their country, can also be considered within this framework. The earlier one is a radio theater performed by Orson Welles in '38. This is the real classic. When the Chinese brainwashed people in prison, their aim was to turn them into adherents of an ideology. The victim was under very difficult conditions. However, the event that took place in the USA about 10 years before the Chinese practice had an impact on the perceptions of countless people in a very short period of time, perhaps an hour. With the widespread panic it caused, a radio drama went down in the history of science. Moreover, Wells's theater example is more similar to the telephone scams we experience. You do not physically deal with the perpetrator. Undoubtedly, there are famous examples of frauds in our country, such as the sale of squares, bridges, clock towers, etc., in which the perpetrator is physically involved. However, with the introduction of mobile phones, fraud has also come of age. The victims of the first person who skillfully used this technique were the leading names of the country. When our old friend began his introduction to his hero, he began by saying that he had no direct relationship with him in real life. Many years ago, he had watched him in court, and a few times when he gave interviews to journalists. Once they had locked eyes, he described that moment in these words: "He was an actor, and I was a spectator. Maybe it would be better to say observer. He was intelligent, he had initiative, and he was not naive." We knew that this word was used sarcastically. He had used it of a famous swindler as, quote, gullible woman, in the sense of ready to be deceived. However, when our old friend characterized the swindler with his own words, I think he meant a negative meaning. As the old saying goes, he had no light in his eyes. Choosing the prime minister of the country as a victim was the end of his life of fraud. Posing as a retired general, he called the prime minister from the prime minister's phone and asked for money, stating that retired and active soldiers wanted to work for his party in the upcoming elections. The prime minister responded positively to this offer and paid him a large sum of money from the secret fund, exceeding his expectations. However, the news that he was arrested in a holiday resort after the woman he was with betrayed him in a shady operation involving a large number of police officers, and a thorough search of the houses was reported on the front page of the newspapers. After his arrest, it is not known how true it is, he said that the then Minister of Justice had offered him 4 million marks on condition that he would not tell the case in court. However, when he admitted that he had received this money from the Prime Ministry, the Prime Minister was criticized for using the secret fund for political gain, and the way to the Supreme Court was set for the Supreme Court. Although the Prime Minister appealed to the Court of Cassation to overturn the verdict and have his name removed from the documents, the Court of Cassation upheld the verdict against the swindler. However, he was found guilty by the Parliamentary Investigation Commission on the grounds that he had, quote, irregularly spent money from the secret fund. However, the Prime Minister was acquitted, as the parliamentary plenary session failed to reach a majority of votes. In his defense during the trial, the Prime Minister stated that it was forbidden by law to disclose the expenditures of the slush fund. Our swindler heroized by the newspapers, was making numerous delusions, such as that he had been targeted by the youth branches of a political party, that the same party would attempt to eliminate him through mafia connections, that there were extra-legal structures within the state. This seemed to me to be a dangerous characterization. How could a swindler be turned into a hero? I followed the hearings from a corner on one occasion. He turned the court into a theater. He used his acting skills to the fullest. With his harsh behavior towards the press and the judges, he was on the agenda of the country and kept it alive. Every word he said made headlines in the newspapers. He believed that only in this way could he guarantee his life. Looking at the photograph as a whole, it is said that those years were the lost years of the country. People were uncomfortable with the illegal activities centered around the relationship between politicians, the underworld, public institutions, and personal interests, which were largely aimed at obtaining money, benefits, and power, and with the fact that these activities were presented as the fight against terrorism and the interests of the country, and hidden behind this veil. It was a time when prisoners ruled the roost in prisons, and in a murder by members of a notorious gang who smuggled in a gun, he was shot in the head while the prisoner next to him was killed. His cellmate was a member of a terrorist organization and had surrendered in remorse. In his confessions, this prisoner had stated that the seemingly opposing organizations that threatened the security of the country were directed from the same center. The king of the swindlers was probably left presumed dead. From then on, he repeatedly claimed that it was really him. He said that the bullet, which could not be removed by surgery, was a gift from the state. Finally, he was among those released from prison with a general amnesty. A few years later, he died in a hospital due to an incurable illness caused by the bullet in his head. No one came to collect his body. He took his place among the barons of the criminal world as one who lived fast and died young. His children did not inherit a fortune, but a troubled life. There was silence for a while. I don't think any of us remembered the details of these events, which were left in the darkness of the past due to rapidly changing agenda topics, because of our fish memory. Our old friend was talking about the quirks of life. His father was also a swindler. During his lifetime, he had access to the only prime minister in the country's history to be executed, reportedly did his private business outside the law, and wrote a book about him. Years later, he advised his son to, quote, play big, and he kept his father's word. He lined up the prominent political and economic figures of the country, men and women alike, and he immediately spent the money he received on gambling with the title of gambler, the second after swindler. His son, when talking about him, said that he had about 150 cases. His father was a folk hero, a Robin Hood, who took from the rich and gave to the poor. He was obviously proud of him, and his daughter, a few years later his brother, wanted for a different fraud, was caught by the police. The family, which close relatives had avoided as much as possible, was broken up. Our old friend admitted that he had difficulty in drawing a portrait of the criminal. The mentality of self-righteousness is probably common to all con artists, as it is to everyone. Each of them lacks the empathy required to put himself in the victim's shoes. The victims are people who deserve to be defrauded, as if they deserve to be defrauded because of their gullibility, as evidenced by the fact that he does not hesitate to express his opinion with the word gullible woman. One famous swindler says that he does not go to the victims, they come to him on their own, as it finds expression in the mentality of the people in the form of, if he can do it, let it be halal. All the blame lies with the victim himself. But let us come to Nasruddin Hoja, as he says in his joke, the thief is not to blame at all. Unfortunately, this was not a story of guidance. Every time I thought I saw traces of transformation in him, I was disappointed. He was a genius who managed to attract people's attention with a lack of empathy and a lack of conscientious feeling that made one worry about the existence of psychopathy. He was a perfect but negative role model for today's generations who grow up with an insatiable need for attention. Judging by what happened, compared to other fraudsters, the amount he took was not so important. What made him dangerous was that his victims were people at the top of power. Not only did he discredit the bureaucracy, but he had the audacity to challenge the system. This reminded me of an old incident. A famous governor, talking to a terrorist who had been captured and then executed for terrorism, asked him, "Why did you do this? The government you opposed has changed." After his retirement, he recounted this memory on a TV program and said that the terrorist replied, "Our case is not with the government, but with the system." I don't think our fraudster consciously opposed the system, like that terrorist, but that's what he did.